When I was a student, apart from reading the best books I could find about music, I noticed that sometimes other disciplines could help explain things music theory didn't address. Books about psychology and perception sometimes suggested intriguing ways of thinking about musical problems. The psychology book that proved the most useful to me was Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow. This book presents the results of years of Nobel Prize-winning research by Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky. In this lesson, I will talk about its implications for composers. Kahneman postulates two mental systems, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the fast, intuitive way we function in most everyday situations. It's not particularly rigorous, but most of the time it does its job adequately. If we meet a neighbor on the street, we don't need to carefully plan every word we say. System 2 is much more rigorous. We manage to get it up and running. It seeks to avoid common mistakes of thinking, looking to apply the appropriate mental models to various situations in a cautious, very deliberate way. System 2 is mainly useful in complex situations where the best response is not necessarily the obvious one. But System 2 is also slow, and it takes a lot of effort to apply. Evolution obviously favored System 1, since in the primitive danger situations faced by early hominids, speed was crucial. If you're being approached by a hungry lion, you don't have time to rationally go through all the probabilities in detail. You just attack or run, fight or flight. But in the more complex situations in our modern world, where extreme speed is not critical, often System 2 is a better alternative. How does this relate to music? Well, music takes place in real time. While we listen to music, we can't stop and think. The music goes on no matter what. That means our primary responses to music are necessarily coming from System 1. Note that System 1 can include previously learned patterns. Driving a car becomes automatic after a while, moving from System 2 at the beginning to System 1. In music, we learn the cultural norms about music very early on, and they certainly become part of our subsequent listening, having been assimilated by System 1. But System 1 remains fast and automatic. Of course, this doesn't mean we can't analyze music in rigorous ways, but it does mean we can't carefully analyze a new piece in real time the first time we hear it. And usually we don't even want to. We want to just enjoy the musical experience. I've analyzed many pieces that I enjoy, but I've never enjoyed a piece because I analyzed it first. I propose here that our primary responses to music are better understood in terms of System 1, and if the music does not successfully appeal to System 1, the listener will not easily engage with the work. One of the main tasks of the human mind is to seek and interpret patterns in the environment. This tendency is so strong that System 1 sometimes even sees patterns where there aren't any, like the man in the moon. When we notice a pattern, System 1 quickly draws various conclusions. Kahneman details various heuristics behind these conclusions. They involve logical shortcuts and errors, but they usually help us. These shortcuts generally consist of simple rules which make sense in an evolutionary survival terms. They're right more often than not. For example, imagine seeing someone slam a door. It makes a loud noise, which we naturally associate with the door closing. There are other logical possibilities to explain the noise, but they're much less likely than the normal relationship between a door slam and a sudden noise. It is as though we automatically interpret simultaneity as causation, or at least as evidence of one single intentional event, that easily explains both the visual and the oral stimuli. Understanding intentions and causation is a very important thing in our lives. We're always trying to distinguish random sensory input from meaningful sequences of events. Music that aims to communicate significantly needs first to convince us that it's intentional and not random. Here's an example. When the trumpet arrives after the oboe phrase here, it sounds rather odd, like a mistake. Seems to have no connection with what preceded it, especially since the strings just keep on playing as though nothing happened. Now a second version. Here all the strings stop at the same time as the oboe, right before the trumpet phrase. Instead of one single trumpet alone, now there are 4 brass instruments participating in the same gesture, and the timpani and string attacks mark it as well. Here the sudden change sounds intentional, even though it's a drastic change of character. This is an example of what I referred to in a previous lesson as the coordination principle. With so many elements synchronized like this, it's downright impossible to hear this as a mistake. Let's look at how System 1 works in a bit more detail. Kahneman's first principle is that we quickly and automatically seek associations when trying to make sense of current information. This isn't a careful, logical, scientific process. The data coming into our senses leads to a very fast mental search for links to current or remembered events, and then to a quick conclusion about its connection, or lack of it, to those other events. In searching for associations between events, we're simply trying to make sense of them. This leads to a basic principle of composition. Every event needs to be audibly related to the events before and after. This requirement is what most people call coherence, but the emphasis here is on coherence of one event right after another. Coherence can also come from longer-range associations, but without the immediate sense that one musical moment is clearly connected with the ones before and after, the listener's impression is simply chaos. Sometimes the association is obvious, like in the first few bars of our example above, creating an immediate feeling of unity. Sometimes it's less so, as when the brass interruption arrives, introducing a certain degree of novelty. But notice that even here, the voice leading between the 2 gestures is fairly smooth. The metrical pulsation continues, as does the string ensemble sound. So the degree of connection is variable, but with no connection at all, we would just hear chaos. Imagine if, instead of the brass gesture, we heard a dog barking. Conclusion, that has definitely nothing to do with the music. According to Kahneman, we're much more sympathetic to things that are easy for System 1 to understand. In general, humans prefer familiarity to strangeness. It's safer. And familiarity translates into cognitive ease. Our tendency to privilege familiar associations via the filter of cognitive ease is again unconscious and automatic. Surely the enormous amount of repetition in most music is, at least in part, motivated by this natural preference. Within any given work, after the opening, the amount of totally new material is usually quite limited. By repeating a given motive, phrase, or section, a composer is teaching it to us. We can then enjoy the subsequent positive feeling of recognition that this repetition provides. This also suggests that music without significant repetition is often hard to grasp. This kind of difficulty, which Kahneman calls cognitive strain, happens when System 1 is overwhelmed. As Kahneman repeatedly reminds us, System 2 is lazy. Since we can't slow down a piece in order to carefully analyze what we're hearing, the listener often perceives music without clear associations, such as repetition, as difficult or even incomprehensible. Given that System 1 takes the path of least resistance, cognitive ease, a composer needs a clear idea about what aspects of the music are most easily heard. I call this a theory of salience. Of course, a trained musician will notice things a layman won't, but this doesn't change the fact that certain kinds of perceptions and associations are much easier to grasp than others, especially at first hearing. Unfortunately, sometimes analysis focuses too much on connections that are not really very salient. Here's an example. Did you notice as you listened that the second half of this example is the retrograded version of the first half? I certainly would not have picked that up, especially on first listening. This is because some techniques, retrogradation inversion as an example, are much easier to see than to hear. What's visually salient often has very little to do with what's easily audible, since the eye can jump back and forth while the ear cannot. Here the rhythmic character of the retrograde is so different from the original that it seems like another idea entirely. Another aspect of salience. As is often mentioned in this course, pitch is not always the main thing we notice. For example, if we imagine the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony played quietly and slowly in the high register by 2 flutes and octaves, the musical character would be very different, despite keeping the pitches the same. On the other hand, I've tried the experiment of playing this opening loudly and vigorously on the piano for non-professional musicians, but substituting a minor third, G, 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 E, for Beethoven's major third, G, 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 E flat. Even though they easily recognize the piece, very few people notice the change of interval since the overall character is unchanged. If we are generally interested in what listeners perceive immediately and easily, that is to say cognitive ease, we can't ignore any dimensions of the music, and we need a clear idea of what's most salient at any given moment. A composer with unrealistic expectations about salience can't communicate with any force. Various degrees of cognitive ease are useful to composers in different situations. Often composers use gradations of cognitive ease to allow the music to breathe, playing with tension and resolution. In traditional terms, this can be seen as the balance between novelty and coherence. Too much novelty just sounds chaotic. Too much familiarity is boring. The main point here is during our first hearing of a piece of music, the things that are easily understood are critically important to its effect on the listener. Music that doesn't respect this rule will usually be found interesting or just incoherent, and therefore it's not likely to get a second hearing. We'll continue this discussion in the next lesson.